but instead we simply chose winners. And as Professor Dieter Helm himself said, governments are very bad at choosing winners, but losers are very bad at picking governments. And the losers persuaded governments to give them huge subsidies for long periods.
Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with a former MP. I think you were MP for 34 years, if I'm not mistaken, for the Conservative Party. You were a deputy leader of the Conservative Party, and you were in the Thatcher and John Major cabinet. And your name, of course, is Lord Lilley, but can call you Peter Lilley. And recently I made a video about the Climate Change Act of 2008, implying that a big culprit for the current energy crisis that we have was that Climate Change Act of 2008. And you were one of the only 5 MPs who voted against it. And someone in the comment section of that video said, "Why don't you interview Peter Lilley?" And I searched your details, and I got your email. And again, thank you for coming on the channel. Maybe talk a little bit about the Climate Change Act of 2008.
Yeah, well, starting there, I voted against the Climate Change Act bill as it then was. Not because I opposed the science or doubted the science. I studied science at Cambridge, physics at Cambridge, and the basic science of global warming is as robust as anything in science. But I was the only person in Parliament who went and got what is called the impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis. The government's bound by law to produce for any new bill to show that the benefits exceed the cost. So I went to the vote office where you get these documents, and they said, "Oh, no one's asked for this. We'll have to cut open the pile of copies, and you can have one." That's how I know no one else had got one. And it was an amazing document because for the first time, I think, of any impact assessment, it showed that the potential costs were twice the maximum benefits. And the costs were all incurred by the British people, and the benefits would be a fractional reduction in the anticipated global warming and the damages thereby experienced by the rest of the world. So it seemed to me you couldn't possibly vote for it. There might be other ways of achieving a reduction in carbon emissions which produce greater benefits than the costs, but this was not it. Unfortunately, I was unable at that stage to persuade others than, as it turned out, 5 of us, 2 tellers and 3 of us who actually went through the voting lobbies to oppose it. Amusingly, though, in the course of the vote, I went down the chamber to fortify myself, knowing that I was going to be outvoted by about 500 to 1 or 500 to 5, and noticed as I went that it was snowing outside in October. So I went back in the chamber and called a point of order in the middle of a vote, which is a rather difficult thing to do, and pointed out to the House of Commons that we were passing this bill based on the assumption that the world was getting warmer at a time when it was snowing in London in October for the first time in 74 years, at which point people shouted out at me, "But don't you realize that extreme cold is a symptom of global warming?" Which made me think this is a very odd phenomenon where warming is a symptom of warming, cooling is a symptom of warming, and almost nothing is not a symptom of warming. So then I began to look at the science, and the basic science of global warming is sound. The attempts to make it more alarming than it really is are very unsound. And so I've been looking at it ever since. But my primary concern is the cost, and the costs have risen over the years. The government Institute did carry out an assessment of the cost of climate change policy, or asked Dieter Helm, professor of energy economics at Oxford, very distinguished academic, to assess it. And he concluded that the way we'd gone about it had probably wasted anything up to £100 billion. essentially because we'd adopted new technologies which were still costly and immature, rather than waiting until they became more economic and more mature before adopting them. And so we were tied in, as we still are, to high costs, higher than necessary costs of renewables. And had we been more cautious about it, we could have waited until the cost of turbines and installing them and so on went down, and we'd had lower cost renewables. None of that, however, of course, would have prevented the current crisis, which is the combined effect of coming out of the pandemic with a sudden surge of demand, coupled with the effect of sanctions on Russia and Russian retaliatory measures, and indeed the war, direct effect of the war in Ukraine impeding supplies of oil and gas, which has put up their price dramatically, and would have been the case whether or not we'd passed the Climate Change Act.
So what about Theresa May? I think it was late 2017, prices are already rising, costs for utilities, and she put a cap on the energy suppliers. Do you think that has also exacerbated a little bit the crisis? Because we saw 31 of these energy suppliers go bust because they couldn't raise the price. I know they didn't hedge, which wasn't very clever.
Well, yes, and that meant, of course, that the costs of supplying their customers has fallen on everybody else, and bailing out or paying the debts of those companies which have gone bust has fallen on the customers of the solvent companies. So that's put up the costs as well. The basic idea of a cap is a rather an odd one. It says not that we cap the price, but we set a cap for a period of 6 months. In the future is going to be 3 months. And during that period, you can't change it. So you hedge for that period, and then the next period you hedge for the next period. So everybody has to pay the cost of the gas plus or cost of the energy plus the cost of hedging. Whereas they might have had the alternative of being unhedged and experiencing more volatile prices, but not having to pay the hedging cost.
Do you you spoke earlier about how they've implemented a lot of these changes very quickly without allowing the technology maybe to get lower cost. So they've rushed us into wind farming and loads of other renewables. What do you think would have been what would have been the best process? Or should they not have rushed? What's your counter argument to the process that has happened since 2008?
An alternative strategy, rather than the government trying to pick winners, saying, well, we think this technology will be good, let's have a special regime for it, offer them fixed guaranteed prices for 15 years and so on. An alternative strategy would be to say, and I'm not saying I particularly support this, but it probably would have been less bad than the strategy we adopted, would have been to say, well, let's work out what the costs of doing nothing are, and then put a tax on fossil fuels to effectively charge them for those costs, and that tax would force people to adopt alternatives when the alternatives were more economic. But instead, we simply chose winners. And as Professor Dieter Helm himself said, governments are very bad at choosing winners, but losers are very bad at picking governments. And the losers persuaded governments to give them huge subsidies for long periods. And even now, when the costs of offshore wind appear to have come down considerably, the recent fields which said they can produce the electricity very cheaply, and the government said, fine, we'll license you to do so, those fields have not yet activated their contracts. So they're actually selling the electricity, not at those cheap prices, which they said they could do, but at the very high market prices currently prevailing, which is set by the high cost of natural gas. So we're not even getting the benefit of the lower costs on the most recent fields, as well as paying fixed prices under long-term contracts to the original fields where the costs were much higher. So we've managed to get the worst of all possible worlds.
Any idea, any thoughts actually on nuclear energy? Maybe that could have been like because it's very clean.
Certainly, nuclear energy is effectively zero carbon in production. There's an amount of carbon dioxide goes into the materials that they're constructed with. The problem has always been both getting permission, getting approvals, and going through to production. Each new nuclear plant is effectively a one-off, and they take a long time to build, far longer than anticipated. That's what we're finding with the new plant which we have started in the UK, and similar plants being built in Belgium and Finland by EDF. So, although in theory, I would like to see lots of nuclear, in practice, it turns out to be very costly and very slow. The one gleam on the horizon is small nuclear, that producing small nuclear plants, which themselves can be mass produced or series produced, should, in theory, be much more economical. You can put one of these small modules on, it'll come on stream straight away, and then the next one comes off the production line, you install that. You don't have to wait until the whole thing's complete before you get a single watt of electricity. But that's still theoretical. We haven't yet licensed any. Hopefully, Rolls-Royce and partners who do produce small nuclear plants for nuclear power stations will be able to upgrade them to something bigger than, for nuclear submarines, they produce them. We'll be able to produce something bigger for nuclear power stations, but still much smaller than the sort of mega power stations which have proved so problematic in practice.
Are you optimistic about how the current political class will solve this energy crisis if they can? I hear both sides of the aisle, and also both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak talking about helping the public even more. But you being probably more of a free market guy, being a Thatcher, started out in the Thatcher era, would probably think that the less government does, the better. What's your view on that? That whether government interference will help at all?
Well, certainly we ought to be reducing government-imposed obstacles on sources of power which are both more reliable and don't have the security problems of importing it, and in the long run cheaper. And the two that can be brought on most rapidly are onshore wind, which is effectively banned, and onshore gas, fracking for gas, which has been an actual embargo placed on it for no good reason at all, purely because of scaremongering by Friends of the Earth and those sort of people who go around telling the most blatant untruths about the dangers. The fracking has been carried out for decades in the United States. More than 1 million wells have been fracked. Not a single building has been destroyed by any so-called earthquakes, which are tremors about the size you get if you dropped a bag of cement from head height on the floor. It's the worst you'll get. Nobody's been poisoned by polluted aquifers. It just doesn't happen because the fracking is way, way below the aquifer. And so that it is about the safest form of technology you can imagine. There's been, we've had 1 million experiments and no failures. What
about clean coal? Because I've read that clean coal basically takes away more than 90% of all the carbon emitted. and we just don't seem to want to talk about it to me.
Um, is clean coal effectively coal with carbon capture and storage attached? Is that what you mean by clean coal?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't yet got carbon capture and storage up and running. In theory, it's very simple technology to extract CO2 from the emissions of power stations, but you then have to pipe it to some offshore oil, a depleted oil field, and pump it into that. And that involves quite a lot of infrastructure. It's actually quite dangerous in one way, because carbon dioxide, though apparently sort of harmless when we breathe it in through the air, if it were to leak from a pipeline, and because it's got no smell, and it can actually cause you to asphyxiate if the atmosphere's sort of 90% CO2 around that leak. So you have to be very careful about leaks. Now, all that can be overcome, but it isn't yet done. So carbon capture and storage is one of those things that's constantly there, just over the horizon, that's going to solve all our problems. But again, according to the Climate Change Committee, using that would double the total cost of switching away from fossil fuels to renewables.
I see. So it would be more expensive than doing what they're doing right now?
Yeah, because you might get cheap electricity from the coal, but then you've got the added costs of extracting the CO2.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you attach it to gas or to cement manufacture or so on, all those things will increase the costs quite significantly.
What about the EU? Did they have a very big influence on making the UK or influencing the UK on voting for the Climate Change Act?
No, if anything, it was the other way around. We persuaded our partners in the EU to go down this route, and then collectively, the EU introduced the entitlements auction. That they sell licenses to emit, or give away, in the case of existing producers, licenses to emit a certain amount of CO2, and then any extra you had to pay for or you could buy from someone else. For a while, that had precious little impact because they produced so many entitlements to emit CO2 that the cost of an entitlement was very, very small. We went further than that. And so once we withdrew, actually we ceased, because we were effectively reducing emissions faster than was generally required. It meant that other people within the EU, to meet the collective total, didn't have to reduce their emissions as fast as the average. So once we left, we forced them all to have to meet the same sort of standards as we'd been meeting without us effectively subsidizing them, as in so many ways we were.
I remember when I was still in the city of London, I worked in the futures market, and remember when they were setting up the carbon futures emissions future, and I thought this is a strange future because it's almost like giving you permission to use something. Do you really think it solves any problem? Because you could have a corporation that emits loads of carbon, and then buy the emissions permit and say, oh, we've gone net zero, even though it's not really gone net zero. It seems like a gimmick to me. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe you can explain it better to me and the viewers.
Well, there are two sort of market-based alternative routes to reducing carbon emissions. One is to set a tax, possibly a tax which will rise over time on emissions, and that will encourage people to find alternative ways of acquiring energy or carrying out industrial processes or whatever, which reduces the carbon dioxide emissions. And as the tax rises, they will find more and more ingenious ways of doing so. The alternative is to say, well, we will ration the quantity by issuing entitlements, and then let the price of those entitlements be set in the market, so that people who've got good ways of reducing emissions will have a surplus of things and they can sell them to other people, or even buy from other people and reduce emissions themselves. So it results in a market-based approach in principle. In practice, of course, particularly in the EU, there are so many lobbying interests which say, oh, we must have some free entitlements, and somebody else is nasty and they mustn't have any entitlements at all, that the whole thing doesn't actually operate as a market-based system, but as a government interference system, and it hasn't worked terribly satisfactorily. I think if I had to choose between rationing the quantity of emissions through an entitlement system and slowly reducing the amounts of entitlements, and a tax-based system and slowly ramping up the tax price, I'd choose the latter. But I'm not very keen on either, as you can imagine.
You said earlier that you don't have any doubts about climate change, and I'm not going to. Well, I guess we disagree on it. I mean, I'm not against keeping the environment clean, but I just think that it used to be called global warming, but then they changed it to climate change. They've been scaremongering a lot of people for 20, 30 years. We were told, oh, if we don't do this, like Al Gore, the polar bears are all going to die, and we've got like Greta Thunberg being an alarmist. What's your view on that? Do you think they're trying to scare us? Are they a little bit too much?
Oh, absolutely. I distinguish between the actual science of global warming, which is that, to simplify greatly, if you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the direct effect of that will be to raise the average temperature of the Earth by about 1 degree. And you'd have to double it again, so it's 4 times the original level, to get a 2nd degree. Now, that may then have some knock-on effects. If it results in some of the floating ice in the Arctic melting, less light will be reflected back into the atmosphere, be absorbed by the oceans, and so there'll be a secondary warming. So, maybe doubling the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will result in more than 1 degree. But the attempts to imagine it will increase the heating of the atmosphere by 3, 4, 5 degrees are just not terribly credible. That is sheer alarmism. So I distinguish between the pure science, which says there'll be some moderate warming if we continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, and the alarmists who say it will be the end of the world. It won't. I put down a question in Parliament saying, is the government aware of any peer-reviewed science produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this world body that's challenged to make us all scared about these things? Did they know any science that suggested that if we did nothing, there would be either mass extinction of humanity or risk of extinction of humanity? And the answer is no, they don't. So the very name of the campaign, extermination, whatever it is, Extinction Rebellion, is a lie. There's no threat of extinction. Life could be more uncomfortable if there's a lot of global warming, but most of us go off on holiday to places much warmer than here, so we can't dislike it too much. Very few people go to the North Pole for their holidays.
The other thing I would say is that historically, if you look at the wealthier nations, their economies and their environments and their modes of production become cleaner and cleaner the wealthier they get.
Oh, absolutely.
So if we try to keep the emerging markets from using the the best technologies they can, and also to try to grow their wealth, I think it will have the negative effect that we're trying to produce.
That's very right. My first career after I left university was working on aid and development programs in developing countries, Africa and Asia. And the one thing I learned is that the key, and it was brought home to me recently at a conference I attended on development, all the Westerners were saying, oh, you must give up using coal and gas. And the people largely from Africa, some from Asia, said, we want to develop, we need electricity. We need cheap electricity. People said, oh, well, how about wind? They said, no, we need cheap electricity. Well, how about, I don't know, subsidies for this? No, we need cheap electricity. But it's the absolute key to development is having cheap and reliable electricity. If we make poor countries adopt expensive and unreliable ways of generating electricity, we hold back their development. And as you say, the less developed they are, the less clean actually their economies will be. But also, in terms of human suffering, people are more vulnerable to natural disasters in developing countries because they're poor. If they can develop and get richer, they will be less vulnerable to natural disasters. In the West, the number of lives lost to natural disasters has fallen by more than 90% over the last few decades, despite global warming. So it is actually wicked what some people are trying to force on developing countries. They can forego the very engine of development, which is cheap and reliable energy.
Just one last question is a little different, just to wrap it up. Seeing that you were in the Thatcher cabinet, I talk about the size of government a lot, and I've looked back to the Victorian times or early pre-World War I period, and the UK government spending never went above 10% of GDP, and now we're at 50%. Are you worried about this, and where would you say is a good level to go back to?
Oh, I am worried. I don't have a number, but it'd be wonderful if we could get back to the sort of levels that we reached under or as a result of Mrs. Thatcher's program, which was nearer a third than a half of GDP being spent. In fact, it was, I think, Roy Jenkins, a trendy Labour chancellor, who said that if ever a government of a country spends more than half the national income, that's a threat not just to the prosperity of the country, but to the democracy of the country, because it then controls so much of people's lives that effectively it makes their choice of who governs them difficult, because the government can influence their choices through the very power of controlling half their incomes.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the John Major government, which you were part of as well, I think the government spending and the debt to GDP were very low, and then New Labour came in, and that's just gone out the window now. It seems like both sides, Labour or Conservative, they don't seem to care.
Well, I think Conservatives do care. We've been through the pandemic, which was a genuine reason for splashing out money and accumulating debt. I think we did it on too great a scale. The trouble is that it's difficult to rein back afterwards, and that's what we ought to be doing now, more vigorously than we are. And though I'm a great fan of Boris in many ways, he was not naturally frugal in his attitude to public finances any more than he was to his private expenses.
Yeah, and I think though, prior to lockdown, he wanted to implement the Swedish program, which was no lockdown or a limited lockdown, and I think that that had a huge impact. And and just to finish off, I think the almost, I don't know if it was total, but it was near unanimity of deciding to do a lockdown. Probably wasn't a great idea, just like you said that the near unanimity of voting for the Climate Change Act would be a big mistake.
Yeah, I think I quoted, was it Harold Macmillan, who said the greatest mistakes Parliament makes are not when it's divided, but when it's nearly unanimous.
Also,
For the obvious reason that in those circumstances, there's no one there saying, hey, but what about this? How much will that cost? And looking at all the negatives. So you make real disastrous decisions.
great, Lord Lilley or Peter Lilley, for coming on the channel. I appreciate your candor and the fact that you want to speak to my channel.
Pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Nice talking to you. Take care.
Thank you.